Hey there, folks. Tim Slade here from the eLearning Designers Academy. If you have been feeling stuck in your job search, or you're trying to break into instructional design or e-learning development for the first time, but you keep hitting a wall, this video is going to be for you. Now, I recently hosted a live panel conversation with a few of my favorite practitioners and hiring managers and career coaches in the industry, Heidi Kirby, Keith Anderson, and Kathleen Volk, to have an honest conversation about what's really going on in the job market right now. We covered everything from building your skills and creating your portfolio to making your LinkedIn presence stand out the right way, and why networking matters more now than ever before. So if you've been wondering how to stand out in what feels like a saturated industry, or you want to know what you should actually focus on in your career development, you're going to get a ton of practical advice and some real talk in this session. Now, before we get into it, if you haven't done so already, please make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and bell button to get alerted the next time I publish a video just like this one. And of course, join us inside the eLearning Designers Academy at elearningacademy.io, where we help new instructional designers and e-learning developers grow their careers by focusing on skills first. Otherwise, enjoy the conversation. Well, welcome everybody to tonight's session. I wanted to do this session because I posted a video earlier this week on the hidden job market, and which featured Heidi and Kathleen and Keith, and it also featured another person, Erin Luber, who was going to be one of our panelists. She wasn't able to join us. She had a small emergency, so Erin is here in spirit. But I created that video with our wonderful panelist here, and the reception of that has been really, really strong. A lot of people really appreciated the practical, down-to-earth explanation of what the hidden job market is, and the conversations we had in it about, transactional networking versus relational networking, and standing out by growing your network. And so I thought this would make a really logical next step to come and have a conversation about standing out in what feels like a crowded job market, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But before we jump in, I would love to have Heidi and Kathleen and Keith introduce themselves. So I'll have you all go real quickly. Heidi, if you want to go first, introduce yourself, tell everybody a little bit about your background and what you do.
Hi, I'm Heidi Kirby. I originally started my career as a college English professor and then moved my way into instructional design and then leading teams of instructional designers, and then moved into freelance and started my own consultancy called Useful Stuff. And then also spun up an L&D community off of Useful Stuff as well, and host an L&D podcast. So I'm a pretty big L&D nerd. I also have my PhD in instructional design and technology, and I've been in the L&D proper field now for 8 years.
Yeah, well, welcome, Heidi. And we will, I'll put links to how you can connect with Heidi and Keith and Kathleen when I share out the recording. So you'll be able to connect with all of them. All right, Keith, if you want to take a moment and introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Keith. And similar to Heidi, I also taught English composition in university setting, and also high school as well, too. I made a transition from teaching into instructional design in a few tech companies, and then I moved up the ladder to manager, to director, and then VP of learning in my last full-time role. Now, as of last year, I have decided to go full-time into career coaching, where I help people looking who are looking to transition into a new career, because that's something I did and it was a big thing. So yeah. So anyway, that's who I am, and I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Happy to have you here, Keith. All right. And then Kathleen.
So it's no surprise that I also taught English at the college level. So I guess
I caught shoplifters.
Right. It's just how the chips fell, right? So I thought it's a good career segue, right, that I was going to be an English professor as well. And then I looked at the realities of the job market, so very in line with the conversation, and said, well, I love working with students, but I don't know about the reality of actually being a tenure track English professor. So I worked in academic support services in higher education for 12 years. So I recruited, I supervised, trained, evaluated about 70 to 90 students each semester who then delivered nursing tutoring, chemistry tutoring, et cetera, and did a lot of academic coaching one-to-one with students and delivering workshops too. Again, looking at the realities of that industry about 6 years ago, I said, I need to get out while the getting is good. Couldn't have seen COVID coming or anything like that. So really transitioning into L&D was a natural sidestep for me. I wound up working in a training specialist role in aerospace and defense manufacturing, which was about as different from learning centers and higher education as you could get, but really built up my STEM engine and my interest in LMS and in quality management and lots of things like that. And so now I'm working as a senior instructional designer at a new product development company.
Yeah. Well, welcome everyone. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim, and I used to catch shoplifters for a living, and then I got into a lot of training and development, right? So it's really exciting and astute journey that I had into this industry. But the reason I wanted to bring the three of you together to tonight's session is because what I really appreciate about all of your backgrounds is that you all have interesting stories about how you got into this industry. And I think everybody who's in this industry has an interesting story once you start asking around. But also, between the three of you, you're all great examples of what is super important to me when we're looking and seeking for advice. You're all practitioners, either currently practicing in the industry, have previously been a practitioner in the industry, worked at leadership levels, the hiring manager level, and you also all have dabbled in, to one extent or another, or have gone into it full time, some form of career coaching, which I think makes you all a really fantastic group to talk about what we want to talk about tonight. So, okay, so here's what I want to do tonight. My goal for tonight's session and for everybody is that I really want to have a conversation that helps us cut through a lot of the noise that I think a lot of people are on the receiving end of as it relates to growing your career in this industry of instructional design, or maybe you're trying to get into it for the first time. I know Heidi and Keith and Kathleen, either you've heard me talk about it before, or you've seen it before firsthand. There is so much noise and minutia and hype and magical thinking that I think gets thrown at people when they're in a place of a job search or a transition. And I think for a lot of people, they find themselves like with their head spinning, trying to figure out what direction to go in. And then they follow advice and it doesn't work out, or they do all the things that they're supposed to do because they were told to do it. And then they're still endlessly applying for jobs. And I think on top of all of that, what makes it a bit of a challenge is the industry. I'm having a hard time saying it is saturated or it feels saturated because that's a very nuanced thing, but there's a saturation within our market that's hard to ignore that I think affects the way that we feel and approach our job search, right? So my first question I want to ask to the panel and to the group, and let's start with this because I want to really dissect what this means. Is the instructional design industry saturated? And what are some truths and untruths about that saturation? Speak. Who has thoughts?
One thing you said, Tim, on LinkedIn earlier today is that it's saturated, but something about how it's saturated with people who might not be the highest quality, right?
Yeah.
And that really resonated with me because I feel like in instructional design, really anything for that matter, there might be thousands or millions of people who are applying for roles and who are interested, but which ones are really cutting through the noise and standing out? That's a much smaller group. And, I would say too that when people get clear on who they are and they start building really authentic connections, which I know we're going to be talking about today, that's when you cut through the noise and you're really seen as valuable and not just another number in the ETS system.
Yeah. I like that. What are the thoughts, Heidi? Were you going to say something?
Hi, I'm Heidi, and I am often quite honest. So what I will share is a little something that I like to talk about when we talk about like e-learning, training content, things like that. And it's Sturgeon's Law. And if you've ever heard of it, it was coined by a science fiction author, but it basically says that 90% of everything is crap. right? So if we think of that in terms of e-learning and training content at organizations, if 90% of all of that training and e-learning is crap, then no, to Keith's point, like it's not saturated because there's room for a lot of high quality instructional designers. And I think there's a lot of tumultuousness with the overall job economy, period. So I think that there is some trouble for people trying to find jobs and trying to navigate the economy and trying to navigate, especially corporate, if you're coming from higher ed or K through 12 education. But I think it's only as saturated as our lowest common denominators, right? And it's never as saturated as Reddit would have you believe.
Or LinkedIn.
I will leave it at that.
Yeah. I don't know, Kathleen, do you have a take on the saturation of the market before I give a spiel?
I think it depends on what each and every organization considers instructional design to be, right? And I think that's a challenge across the industry is there is no one boilerplate job description where you can expect, I'm going to do all the e-learning development. In another role, you might be literally on the front end doing all the consulting and then pass it off to someone else. So that's just one example of how consistency really varies from organization to organization, let alone internally across training teams within a bigger company. So I think that's a factor as well that can really get us spinning.
Yeah. One of the things I think you said, Keith, that resonated with me, you said something about noise, and there's a lot of noise out there. And I think when we think about the saturation of the industry, is the industry saturated? Yeah, but it's not saturated with a bunch of high quality talent. And I think that, when you go on LinkedIn and you look at a job and you go, oh my gosh, how many ever people applied for that job, even though we all know that that's not even a true number as it is. The issue is that there's a lot of noise out there in terms of the applicants. And there's a lot of people that I think are all trying to do the exact same thing, and they're following a cookie cutter approach. And the thing that I wrote down after you said it is like, are you doing things that make you blend into the noise or cut through the noise? And I think a lot of people are taking steps that are blending into the noise, either out of ignorance or out of fear or whatever. But there's a lot of noise and a lot of numbers out there. But it doesn't mean that just because there's hundreds of people applying for a job, it doesn't mean that you're competing with hundreds of qualified applicants. Yeah.
Yeah, 120% agree. And it's interesting you say that. I'm curious with Kathleen and Heidi if you've experienced this, but I know for me, when I've opened instructional design roles, I get a whole bunch of messages on LinkedIn, like, wow, this sounds like an interesting role. I have 20 years experience doing da da da. Are you open to an informational interview? So I think the approach, yes, about meeting people and talking to people is good, but like at a high level, yes, but like how to do it is something very different.
Yeah. Heidi, Kathleen, any thoughts on that?
I think to Keith's point, also waiting until the role is open to message somebody and say, hey, here I am, is a little bit too reactive, and like it's almost too late, right? You're almost too late if you come into somebody's DMs once the job's already posted. And, I think there is a lot of bad advice around like you should always find the recruiter and message them and, ask them for their time. And, I think it really highly depends, right? Some people don't read any of their messages, right? Some people don't like being messaged, which I always found kind of odd for recruiters, but they all have their idiosyncrasies. And I think the other thing is I see a lot of people copy what they think they're supposed to do. So whether that's like LinkedIn posts, right? And they copy people like Adam Grant, right? And like, he's somebody who's got a massive network. He's just doing maintenance posts, right? And you're trying to grow your network and you're copying somebody in maintenance mode. You need to kind of like step outside, because a lot of the times I see too, very experienced L&D professionals say, I was part of a RIF, I'm open to work, and I have all this great experience. I'm really experienced. I've been in the field for 20 years. You should hire me. And that's it. And they don't really talk about that experience. They don't really tell stories about what they did. They don't really connect what they've done in the past to what they're trying to do moving forward. Or they post like, hey, look, I got this certificate. And that's it. They didn't say what they learned from it, what they were able to do with it, how they used it, you know. And so I think some of these things are just bad advice, and people are doing the best that they can, but they're just being given kind of like generic, broad advice, right?
So my question to that is, I have like a duality of feelings about this, because if you're somebody who's coming into the industry for the first time, right, you're looking from the outside in, naturally you're going to be looking for, okay, well, give me the 5 things I need to be doing. Give me my checklist of what I need to be doing in order to make this transition, right? And so naturally, I understand the need and the desire to go, okay, I gotta, I'm just gonna list all the common things that people say, like, oh, I gotta learn these skills, I gotta build a project, and then I gotta put it in a portfolio, and then I gotta like use this new resume template and add these keywords, and then like I gotta do these things, and then you do them, and then you still find yourself spinning your wheels. Like, how do people, what's the happy medium there between, yes, there are certain things that you should be doing and prioritizing, but then how do you do it in a way that helps separate you from the rest of the herd? I don't know if there's an easy answer for that, but I'll put that out there to the group.
Well, I guess for me, I would say that, there are things like checklists, and I do think overall broadly that can be really helpful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're new to an industry or what have you. That being said, this isn't the best expression, but the devil's in the details, or the tactics and strategies you use, right? For example, a lot of people know, like, yes, you want to have connections with people, and that could help you move into a new company, but the approach they take might be off. So that checklist alone doesn't really work, right? It's about the quality, not the quantity.
Mm. Yeah. Kathleen, Heidi, any thoughts on that?
And sort of what's your pie chart of your skills, your experience, how you want to sell yourself? Do you actually understand what this organization does and sort of what your role will be within it? I know from the outside that can be kind of daunting, but as you start cracking the eggs and doing the research, finding ways to demonstrate that in your materials and initial conversations. And I think also really looking at the culture too. So I mean, for you, you kind of have to pie chart that yourself, and you can cut the pie in 8 slices or 2 or 3, depending. But I think it's a unique blend that you have to be really aware of in terms of how you're presenting yourself, preparing your materials too.
Yeah. Um, as we talk about this, as you know, if you're somebody you're doing all of the things, you're learning the skills, you're building a portfolio, you're building the projects, you're doing all of those things. I think one of the words I wrote down that you've kind of alluded to, Keith, or one of the things that the words I wrote down that you made me think about was the word authenticity. And it's like, how are you following the checklist, but you're doing it in a way where you're staying true and authentic to yourself? Because I think part of the problem when we think about saturation in the job market is that, hold on, I'm getting a pop-up window. We're not doing an AI companion in this thing. I'm denying all of the AI companions. I think the challenge is that when you follow a checklist almost to the point where you're not considering yourself and where you fit in all of these things, you end up creating this like, it's like you take all of the colors and you blend them together and it becomes this weird brown gray thing, you know what I mean? And then when everybody else is doing the exact same thing, everyone just blends in. And it kind of then defeats the purpose of having a portfolio if everyone's portfolio looks the same. Or it kind of defeats the purpose of having a resume when everyone's using the exact same keywords, right? And so it's this like weird duality of how do you follow a prescribed pathway that might be valid, but do it in a way where you're still being authentic to yourself and you're seeing yourself in the work. I don't know if that resonates as I describe that with anybody or if that elicits any thoughts.
Yeah, so one of the things that I did in like my personal life that then I realized was really, really beneficial for my professional life as well was and this like full transparency, this happened post-divorce, right? So post-divorce, when I was like, I think I want to start dating again at age 35 when I hadn't been on any dating apps ever. I made a list of my core values, right? So I made a list across different facets of my life, right? Like friends, family, career, hobbies, like just across all these areas, what my values were, what I felt like, was where I was coming from. And then I kind of turned those all into a list of like 5 or 6 overall core values. And one of those values, the top 3, is usefulness. And then that became part of my brand of useful stuff, right? And making L&D useful. And I think when you can tap into your core values like that, you can kind of make this list of like, okay, what are all my core values? And then you can talk about what you want to do career-wise through that lens. Like, hey, I talk about L&D through the lens of usefulness and kindness, right? And understanding that kindness doesn't always mean telling you what you want to hear. Sometimes it means telling you what you don't want to hear, but in a way that understands that we all make mistakes, we all have a learning curve. And when I started showing up like that, I found that my content resonated so much better. My resume reflected it, my cover letter, my work samples reflected it. And it was just it was so much easier to talk about myself, to talk about the work that I was doing and that kind of thing. And it made it so much more seamless.
So my question then for that, and this is for Heidi or for the group, what you just described then, how does that translate? And you kind of hinted at a little bit of it, but how does that translate to standing out from the crowd when you're thinking about your priorities from whatever it is, your skills development, your portfolio, or your resume? I mean, what I hear is intentionality in what you're describing, but I'm curious to hear how else that might show up in making somebody stand out from the crowd versus somebody who's blending in with the noise.
I think it gives you a unique spin, right? I think it gives you a unique angle with which to enter this industry from, right? Because anybody can say, I make effective learning experiences, right? Like you've seen that in so many headlines, right? Like I make effective learning experiences. But what if you say, I make inclusive learning experiences? What if your core value is, I'm trying to think of something that is not one of my core values to use as an example. What if your core value is compliance, right? Hey, there's a space for everyone. Like I love making compliance courses and that's what I do. Like every different possible core value that you can have. I'm a rule follower. I'll help you follow the rules too, right? Can be turned into something like that.
Yeah. So go ahead, Kathleen. And I have a follow-up question for you too, Kathleen.
Heidi, that's so funny. And Heidi and I have a history of synchronicity like that. So English teacher thing, maybe, I don't know. But in my professional summary and my resume, I actually have a selling point that I love compliance, that I'm going to bring those standards and help you meet reporting standards or things like that. I mean, it's not verbatim, obviously, but it was an important part of my job in aerospace and defense and also in higher education to a point, and I love it. So I'm in that little space over there.
Yeah.
And it's better to own it and use it if I see roles or something like that where I know it's a good fit. Hey, it's something that I know that I'm going to enjoy. So why not lead with it?
Yeah. So, so I think that the hurdle then for a lot of folks, let's say you're a newer practitioner and you're still upskilling and you're trying to figure out, what that thing is that makes you unique and different. The thing that I'm reminded of, and I don't know how or if it's related, but I'll throw this at you, Kathleen, is one of the things that you and I have talked a lot about recently is that idea of being a professional in training. And I think for a lot of folks, the hurdle that prevents them from getting to that point of intentionality is seeing themselves in the work that they want to be doing. You know what I mean? And understanding like why am I trying to get into instructional design? And is that why deeper or greater than me just wanting to leave what I was doing previously? You know what I mean? And so I don't know. Can you explain that concept of being a professional in training and how that might relate to more intentionality and how you show up?
Sure. I saw this professional in training behavior and need a lot when I was coaching graduate students one-on-one in higher
Mm,
education. They were quite often health science students. So imagine this person who worked really hard to get into PA school. They want to be a physician assistant. They've taken a few tests. They're studying the old way of memorizing and just regurgitating. And then all of a sudden they hit the wall and go, I don't know what to do next. I worked my ass off to get into PA school. And now how am I going to get there? And so then they'd come to me and I'd say, you got to start thinking and studying like a PA. You have to see yourself in the work, as you just said so beautifully. And then what does that involve? And then how do you change your strategies and get more and closer to that PA, the goal that you want to be?
yeah. I'm just writing a note down. Keith or Heidi, if you have anything to say while I finish writing this, by all means.
Yeah, a few things coming to mind with that in terms of finding your identity either in the instructional design space or just in the professional realm in general. Um, one thing I have found useful on my resume and when I'm talking to people is actually presenting myself a little quirky, right?
Mm,
Because there's so much stuff with people saying the same thing, like 20 years experience. I have all the same skills as everyone else. And if you don't stand out, especially now with AI, what is really interesting about you? For example, one thing I put on my resume, and I always get asked about this during interviews, is I say, um, I I was in a pie competition and I came in third place. Like
mm.
it's something that people are like, oh, huh, that's weird. Like, tell me about that. So these kind of sticky moments, right? That aren't necessarily that aren't really at all actually in like the weeds of storyline or tools or, you know, compliance or anything, but really kind of humanize you. Those can be other great ways to help you stand out of the crowd.
Yeah. I think there's two things that make me, as you say that, Keith, and that I think resonates with some of the audience here tonight is that um, I think a lot of times people who are in that process of job search, they they're sold this message that anything that makes them different or unique should be hidden or not highlighted at risk of coming off weird or different or unprofessional. And I see this a lot with teachers, people get this awful advice of like, if you're a teacher, don't call yourself a teacher on your resume, like call yourself something else or minimize that because that's somehow not going to be advantageous for you. Or, on the opposite extreme, Kathleen, you and I both know, and I think he's okay with me sharing this. You and I both worked with somebody who was a former Catholic priest. And for the longest time, he was trying to figure out how to tell his career story without saying, I was a Catholic priest. And he has a really great story. He met a wonderful woman and got married. And the same thing with teachers. Like the teachers that I've worked with who have their breakthrough moment, it's once they stop trying to position their experience as anything other than what it was. And the same thing happened with the person that we worked with, Kathleen, is they stopped trying to present themselves as anything that they were, and they show up truly as their authentic version of themselves, however it fit into the industry. And that's when they had that moment of breakthrough. And so I think there's this
Yeah.
like people contrive trying to blend in, and it ultimately ends up being that they're in the saturation rather than being out of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It becomes this palimpsest of layers of layers of layers. And then you start peeling back and it all just gets very confusing. And you're kind of caught up trying to translate the old stuff into L&D speak. But then if you're hiding something or you're feeling judged or you're feeling like it's not going to land right, then that can overcomplicate too. And I mean, I remember 6 years ago having that feeling, leaving higher education into that very first L&D role and saying, hey, I was creating training nonstop. I was facilitating nonstop. I was doing all these things that are very copacetic to L&D, and I still felt like that and felt like very garbled in terms of my first couple attempts at a resume. So we've
Yeah.
all been there.
Yeah. So if we put our hiring manager hats on, this is my question for the group. If you put our hiring manager hats back on, what are some of those things that's going to make a potential candidate stand out to you? Uh, that otherwise wouldn't? Like, as you think about that from your experience, what are those things that help somebody stand out differently from the rest of the herd?
Oh, I have a big one for this.
Okay, go.
Critical thinking. Like when I can kind of read through a resume in LinkedIn and tell like, oh, this person is reflective. This person has learned lessons on what they've done. That speaks volumes, right? To me, that speaks so much more volumes than just tools you've had and, you know, just different accomplishments, right? Because, you know, reading through that, you get to know who this person is. Because when you're a hiring manager, it is, yes, people's past experiences can inform the present and the future, but they're hiring you for your present and your future. So, like, being able to see these skills in terms of how it would be working with you is highly desirable. Yeah, so.
I like that, Keith. Heidi, go ahead.
I think to kind of expand on Keith's critical thinking, because I totally agree. One of the things that I look for, and one of the things I want to tell people on the call who may not realize this, and I find that this is true for a lot of the hiring managers I talk with as well, is that we don't look at portfolios. I never looked at portfolios until after the phone screen. So until the recruiter talked to somebody that I selected based on their resume only, until they passed the phone screen, I didn't even look at the portfolio. And when I did, gosh, I had maybe 10, 15 minutes tops. Because think about if you're a hiring manager and you are hiring for a headcount, you are down a person. So who is doing that work while that person is not, while that spot is not filled, while that space is not filled? Your team probably is, but you probably are too. So your time is already limited. And so, like, I'm not spending 30 to 45 minutes diving into somebody's portfolio, doing their entire e-learning sample. And really, I don't really care about the output as much as I care about the input, right? And so when I'm looking for critical thinking skills on a resume, I'm looking, did you learn enough about what we do here in instructional design that you can tell me how your experience before is relevant without trying to pretend that it's the same thing, right? Because when people try to pretend that what they did before is the exact same thing as what we do, like as a college professor, what I was doing was similar, but it wasn't the same thing as what I do in instructional design. Understanding that nuanced difference has been the difference between somebody being hired and not on my team multiple times. So that kind of critical thinking, did I do the foundational work to find out what this field is all about? And I'm not talking tools, okay? Not learning the tools, because those tools are going to be gone in 5 years. They're going to be gone in 10 years. I'm talking about the foundational skills that you need, the ability to communicate with people who are difficult to get information from, the ability to solve a problem with or without training, right? Those are the types of things I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And
Kathleen, go ahead, Keith.
Sorry, and to piggyback on that, you know, another piece that I think is really important is when you're interviewing, you're not just trying to appease the person you're talking to and just say, wow, that's a great idea. Wow, wow, wow. But like you're being critical and questioning them, right? And, you know, acting like a team player, right? Like being on that same level with the hiring manager or anyone you're interviewing with, not seeing yourself as just an applicant and just answering the questions thinking, oh, am I answering the question the best way? It's about being at that level, right? Conversationally.
Yeah. Before I pivot, Kathleen, anything you would add that would make a candidate stand out for you?
I think to bring some threads from both of you together, I want to see curiosity, because curiosity makes a good consultant. And so, Heidi, to your point, the tools come and go, can flex, go deep in those. Keith, to your point, as you started us with the critical thinking piece, I think that brings it together. Are they curious about how we go to business, what we do, how the team functions? Can they link, to your point, past experience and sort of start to see themselves in the work as the conversation progresses in the interview? And then I want that person to be curious, because they're going to have to get to know power structure in the company, how things get done, how to get around obstacles, all those sorts of things. And that's going to be a really critical, persistent personality trait that they're going to need to have.
Yeah. I think what's important to mention too is that these aren't all things that have to only be demonstrated during an interview or on your resume. These things show up in how you show up on LinkedIn, what type of content you post, or how you interact with other people, what you put in your portfolio. These things show up in a lot of different ways that kind of build this like aura around you of somebody who's more intentional, thoughtful, curious, that sort of stuff. I think for me, the one that is important to me when I'm evaluating a candidate, the one that comes to mind off the top of my head is that I want you to be understanding enough of your skill set where you can define the parameters of what you're capable of, and you're self-aware enough to go, and this is where I still have room to grow. And what I think what's powerful about that is it shows a level of vulnerability and self-awareness. And a lot of times it creates cognitive dissonance in that mind of a hiring manager because when you're on the other side of the table, and I so wish everybody could experience being on the other side of the table, 99% of candidates spend most of their effort trying to say what they think they're supposed to say to appease the hiring manager, to your point, Keith. And the thing that always makes me smile deep down inside is when somebody says the thing that you're not supposed to say to the hiring manager, where they go, yeah, I'm not really good at that, but I know that and I can work towards that thing. You know what I mean? Does that make sense as I say all that?
100%. And I think, similar to what you just said with vulnerabilities, both vulnerabilities and curiosity are so important. Be questioning, right? Always be questioning and identifying problems there and then solutions, right? Because at the end of the day, we're all working together to identify solutions and make things as good as they can be. So yeah, 100% agree.
Okay, so my next question is, and Heidi, you brought up a little bit of this. You talked a little bit about portfolios. We're kind of touching in on interviewing. We talked maybe a little bit about LinkedIn, or at least I mentioned the word LinkedIn. I don't remember. But my question for the panel then is, what are some of those things that people are told they're supposed to prioritize as part of their career development or career search or transition that often easily sends them down the wrong path or contributes to them blending into the herd or isn't as important from a hiring manager standpoint as it's oftentimes made out to be on LinkedIn?
I have a big answer for this
Yeah,
one.
I want to
And
know yours.
it's always my answer. It is that you are not a web developer. You are not a web designer. You do not need a whole stinking website to showcase your portfolio if you don't want to have one. I haven't had a website to showcase my work, but for maybe like a year out of my career. And it was like towards the beginning when I thought that that's what I needed. Now I I have a Google Drive folder. I also have a little like 1 minute reel that I made in Canva of a bunch of my different projects that I just send the link to that out to people if they want to see my work. And I've received work samples in so many different ways. I've accepted links in an email before, like just here's a bunch of links, link to storyline projects or PDFs or attachments or whatever. I've also accepted PowerPoints where every different slide represents a different project that they want to share. So this idea that we have to make like a fully functional website is so weird. Like, where is this coming from that we need to make whole websites, you know?
Well, I've talked a lot about this too online, like the idea that a portfolio does not mean building a website. A portfolio is not a website. A portfolio is a collection of work that demonstrates what you're capable of doing, your judgment as an instructional designer, whatever your area of practice is, and the type of work you're interested in doing. And so I think that's like when I think about that particular thing that you mentioned, Heidi, is that the advice where people get off track is they start taking generalized advice about what should be in their portfolio, how it should be built, or what should it be look like. And I see people who have like, oh, time and time and time again, they're like, well, I need my one storyline project, and then I have my Rise project, and then I have the job aid I created in Canva, and now I got my Beyond video, and it's just a smattering of things where you're like, look, I can do all the things. And then I always love asking the question. I'm like, well, what of these things would you want to be doing 9 to 5 every day? And they're like, well, I really love the analysis part of design. And I'm like, then why did you create a bunch of multimedia? You know what I mean? So I think that's like where the intentionality part comes into play, you know? I don't know, Kathleen, Keith, any thoughts on that?
I I very much agree. One thing I see a lot, especially with newer instructional designers, is the idea that I can do everything. I'm talented and
Mm,
all these tools, I can do all this. But when you don't focus, it becomes muddled what you're doing and you become generic, right? And a commodity, which is not something that uh looks good, honestly. Um,
yeah.
what one thing I do also want to say about portfolios, and about a website and showing your work. One thing I have found actually pretty important, believe it or not, is the visual design and that first impression that people have with your work. Now, in instructional design, you're not, it's not always about graphic design. That's kind of a different beast. That being said, a lot of times on hiring panels, maybe the manager has instructional design focus, but a lot of times, at least in my experience, there have been program managers and people in marketing and all these different other people who are looking at the stuff too and are interviewing you. And it's about the sites that matter. They don't know about the nitty gritty of instructional design.
Yeah. I think what's important to mention in what you're describing there, Keith, and this is another important thing for a lot of folks to realize, is that what's important to one hiring manager or one organization or one team might be totally different to another hiring manager or team. Or what's important to one person you're interviewing for at a company could be totally different than another person that you're interviewing for at a company. And I think the challenge that a lot of people face when it comes to what projects they work on or what skills they choose to work on or what they do with their portfolio is that when you do these things trying to appeal to everybody, you end up appealing to nobody. And part of what's super important, though, is that then you decide, well, what's important to me as a professional? What type of work do I want to be doing? I remember my first portfolio, I've told this story many times before, but my first portfolio, I made the mistake of doing what I see nowadays. I was like, I'm going to include an e-learning course, and I'm going to include a facilitator guide and a participant guide, and I'm going to include job aids and a video, and I'm going to include all of these things. And what that resulted in is hiring managers and clients were like, yeah, but what is it that Tim really specializes in out of all of those things? And what does he really want to be doing? And if you can't determine that, then it's just like, I guess he can do a little bit of everything. But when I really thought about it, I was like, no, I really wanted to be doing e-learning development. And so then I stripped all the other crap from my portfolio and went knees deep into that, you know? And I think too, what's important to recognize though, is that when you do that, you have to also get comfortable with the fact that you're not going to be the right fit for every instructional design job out there. Yeah.
100%. You don't need to fit inside a box
Yeah.
all the time,
Right.
right? Like that's the thing. And that's what the job market and like applying to things, that's kind of the impression, like, okay, they have all these requirements. This is the job description. You need to fit each one. And if you don't, then you're not a good fit. And that implies, right, that you need to be a cookie cutter. And it's actually the opposite, I find. So it's counterintuitive. It's interesting though.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Kathleen, go
Kathleen, I
ahead.
didn't mean to
Yeah.
cut you off.
Oh, no worries, no worries. I think it's important to realize also that a job description, while it is really a cornerstone of your entry into that organization and a basis for what you're going to be doing as an applicant, it's also sometimes now written by AI. Sometimes it's literally pulled out of a drawer and dusted off. Sometimes 20 different cooks are in the broth. So lots, Keith, I love your reaction. You're like, hell yes. So in that regard, sometimes it really is this wish list of purple unicorn, as they say, types of things. Again, it really varies organization to organization. In some cases, maybe a hiring manager sits and writes it very carefully and really agonizes over every bullet. So in that regard, being true to yourself and having that thread of authenticity is really important. And knowing also a lot of times we trap ourselves and say, I'm not going to apply for that. I'm only like 60 or 70% qualified, and like bust that notion, because the reality that that purple unicorn is out there for that wish list is usually not going to happen.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Heidi.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one like hot take tip of advice, because I think it's really important to have your own spin and do your own unique thing. And like, if you want to make a course on something quirky that is just related to your interests, I think that's a great idea. However, what I will say is that a good hiring manager will be able to spot it immediately if it doesn't belong in the format that you've crammed it into, right? So if you want to make something about something that you enjoy, do a needs assessment. Do it on your imagined learners so that you choose the right delivery method, right? Because I always use the example of people who create an e-learning module on how to train a puppy, right? Because they love dogs and they have 4 dogs, and that's lovely and that's great. And it's awesome to show your personality. But I promise you that no one with a puppy is stopping whatever they're doing with that puppy to take an e-learning course, right? And it sometimes what you're trying to do like magnifies the disconnect, that you don't understand kind of the process, the right questions to ask, the right delivery methods. And if you default everything to an e-learning, it's like, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but you end up busting a hole in the drywall, right?
Yeah, what I think is important about that, I'm glad you bring that up, Heidi, is because I think that demonstrates, usually that's when people are prioritizing learning the tool and they're trying to show, look, I used a tool to create something without thinking about, well, did it make sense to create it that way in the first place? And it's not that. We were just having this conversation with some of my students earlier this week when they were when people are trying to define a project topic for something they want to create for their portfolio. The epiphany I had recently is like people go, well, I need to do a business topic. And it's like, no, it doesn't necessarily need to be a business topic, but it needs to be something where you can clearly define what would have to be true for the training to be needed in the first place. And then also what would have to be true in order for it to make sense for it to have been e-learning, if that's what you're going to create as an e-learning course, So you can take any topic, and as long as you contrive it to the situation to go, okay, here's what would have to have happened in order for there to be a training issue. Here's how I would have evaluated that training issue or that performance problem. Here's what would have to be true in order for e-learning to be fit for function for it. And here's how I would evaluate it. Like going through that exercise, even if you have to make some of that stuff up, though, that's going to do a much better job of demonstrating your ability to think like an instructional designer than just like, hey, I created a course on, making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right?
And I would say too, to include those things, all of those things that you just said, that story in your portfolio, in your work samples, because again, I don't want to just see the output. There's also a really big problem right now among hiring managers with instructional designers like plagiarizing each other's work, right? So if all you have is a bunch of finished products, I don't know if that was yours, if you worked on it with somebody else. And if you include that story, if you include that, here's how I imagine the learners, here's how I ask the right questions, here's how I would evaluate this if I was actually working in a company. I'm not, this is just hypothetical. I can learn more about you from your hypothetical story than I can from just your output. You know what I'm saying, as a hiring manager? And so I think that including that story and that like description and that like where it came from, why I did it, is incredibly important in making you stand out, because a lot of people don't do it.
Yeah. All right, let's pivot. We talked a little bit about portfolios. I like that. Along those themes, what are things that are leading people down a path of blending into the saturation or leading them down a path where it's counterintuitive? I want to pivot and talk about LinkedIn And what are those things that people are doing on LinkedIn that might be hurting their job search? And what can they be doing differently to help themselves stand out? I know I have a lot of thoughts and spicy takes on this. So I'll be the first one to rip off the Band-Aid when I talk about it. I think the biggest thing that hurts a lot of people's job prospects, and I was just having a conversation with somebody about this today, and it's a very nuanced thing, so hear me out. It's not that you put up a green banner. It's how you act when you have it up. And one of the things that I've talked about lately, Heidi, you and I have talked about it, Kathleen, you and I have talked about it, is this thing that I call green banner behavior. And when people buy and when people get into the trap of falling for what I call green banner bait, all right? I think the thing that's important to remember is that there's nothing bad about having a green banner up. Some people say, oh, it makes you look desperate. I don't think it makes you look desperate. I think it's great. Put your green banner. Let people know that you're looking for work. But when you have it up, I think you're judged differently than when you don't have it up, because it becomes a representation of how might you behave as an employee if I choose to hire you. And I think there's been this like slipping of LinkedIn being treated like Facebook, where it's like, ugh, the job search sucks, so I'm gonna go on LinkedIn, I'm gonna lament about it while I have my green banner up. Well, what does that signal to a hiring manager or somebody you might be considering working with you? So I'll just throw that out there. Thoughts, feelings on that, just to rip the Band-Aid off.
Well, one thing I'll say, while I know, Tim, you're good with the banner, don't recommend that.
That's okay.
Essentially, yeah, if you think of LinkedIn, it's like that first impression you're making with someone, and looking at that profile picture is like who they are. And like when I say, hi, my name's Keith, right? If I'm saying, hi, my name's Keith, and I'm looking for work, like it's not what you need to be saying immediately, right? Essentially with LinkedIn, and really like about the hidden job market in general, is it's all about authenticity, right?
Mm.
And just like you would in like an in-person conversation, how are you making this someone, like if you're at a dinner party or somewhere where they want to continue talking with you and not say, okay, next. So yeah, I think it's really important to be very intentional what you want that first few seconds of someone noticing you sees and thinks, and I think that open to work is something that you don't need to necessarily say in the first like 10 seconds or so.
No, I mean, it's probably something you shouldn't say,
yeah,
because then it just
yeah,
makes the person on the receiving end. We talked about this in the hidden job market video about transactional networking versus
yeah,
relational networking. If that's what you're signaling or the first thing you say, then it feels like the whole conversation has the ulterior motive
yeah,
of, are you just going to get me work? You know what I mean?
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So on
It,
that topic, whenever I talk about green banner behavior, I think people go, well, what do you exactly mean by that? Like, what are some examples of that? I think we've all witnessed it in different capacities. Any other examples that might help people listening? What do I mean when I say green banner behavior?
So I think one thing to note here is that,
And it's not exclusive to green banner people.
oh, yes,
It just becomes more highlighted when it's like, yes.
but I think something to take note of is that the green banner is controversial,
Yeah.
right? Like Keith has said, don't do it. Tim's like, ah, and I'm like, I don't care if you do it. Like as a hiring manager, I could not care less either way, right? But I think when gosh, I see this so much. When people have the green banner up and they're consistently posting, like you said, the complaints about the job market, right? How hard it is to find a job, or this very, very desperate, like, I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage next month. I've seen a lot of that. I have a heart, but I also work for a business, and that business does not have a heart. They don't give a shit if you cannot pay your mortgage. They want someone who has a particular skill set, who could start ASAP, who can do a certain job and do it well and not get me as the manager in any trouble, right? So you have to understand, like, it's business, right? It's just business. Just like those rejection emails, it's just business. especially the rejection emails that you get where you never even talk to a real human being. That's not anything about you as a human being. That's just business, right? And so I often find myself when people start posting stuff like that and when they start complaining and things like that, I go, do they realize we can see this? Like, we can all see this, right?
And our industry is small and we do see it. We do see it. And I think it's to your point, Heidi, and this is where it gets nuanced, is that your feelings about the job market being tough are valid feelings. Your feelings about, oh, this employer ghosted me and that's frustrating, that's a valid feeling. Or "Ah, I need to pay my mortgage and I'm worried about that. Those are valid things. But those aren't things that hiring managers make business decisions based off of. And so when I say green banner behavior, it's like we can have that debate about whether the green banner is good or not. But I think what is not debatable is how you show up if you choose to put it up. And even if you don't choose to put it up, how you show up on LinkedIn is a representation of who you are as a professional. And it's a representation of what am I investing in if I choose to hire you? And I think the alternative to it that I would recommend for the group, if you're looking to find ways to stand out, is you have to think about who your target audience is. Who does lamenting about the job search, who does that appeal to? It only appeals to other people who are in the same bucket as you are. And so what you should be focused on posting is your experiences. Share your work, share your process, share a story related to something that demonstrates your value. And some days you may not have nothing to share, and that's okay. But I think that the issue is that when you make your whole brand about the struggle of your job search, it just tends to feed that. And I think too, I use the term green banner bait. What I mean by that is there are people on LinkedIn who will contrive posts to get engagement from other people who are struggling in the job search. And it's just to get you to be angry and to bait you into comments and likes. And the problem with that is the way LinkedIn works is LinkedIn's a social media platform. And so if all you interact with are people who are struggling with the job search, what is LinkedIn going to feed you? It's just going to feed you more people who are struggling with the job search rather than hiring managers or practitioners who could be helping you. Yeah. Okay. We have a few minutes remaining. One last area I'd love to touch on that I think is another area that gets people tripped up when it comes to standing out, and it kind of relates to LinkedIn. Can we talk about badges and certificates and other perceived pieces of evidence or artifact that demonstrate a skill set? As a hiring manager, do you care about badges or certificates?
I feel like this could be debatable. So I'll share my piece on this. I think it really, really depends on which one. There's a lot of people that put LinkedIn learning courses on there. Personally, I don't like, okay, you took an hour-long course, like great,
That would be like posting, I watched YouTube videos today.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. But I'll tell you, Tim, and I'm not just saying this to like, just to say great things about you, but if I do see someone who's gone through your academy and like, okay, this is someone legit, this is someone who's dedicated to instructional design. And I do think highly of you and what you're doing, right? So I think about that. So it really depends on what the certification is. It's not a numbers thing. It's all about quality. And I would say, especially in the instructional design space, as you said, Tim, it's a small industry. So we know like all the different boot camps that are out there and academies and all of that. And we all the hiring managers I know and people in L&D have pretty strong feelings about this too, right? So
I'm biased, so I can't.
I know, right? You can't answer, but Heidi and Kathleen can. So
Yeah.
I think with a certification badge, something like that, cool, that was your milestone. Are you going to be able to keep doing the thing? And also, can you translate in your materials in your interview how you envision yourself carrying it forward? Like if it's Google UX certification, I've known people who've done that, and that's cool. And if you're seeing a difference in your work, if you're threading that through into your samples or things like that, great. then I would say include it. But again, if it's one of those just sort of like, hey, I'm running the bases, as you said, Keith, with things like that, then sure, you're doing it more for your own informal or non-formal learning, and it's getting you to a certain point. But I'd say translating it and really being able to sort of quantify and qualify it is key.
Yeah. Heidi, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of say the same thing that Kathleen just said, where it's more about your overall professional development as a whole. And if part of that is that you did those certifications and you also, I'm looking for the whole picture, right? If you earned some things here and there, and there's a question in the chat about what if you see those IB academies that aren't good programs? I take that into account in your professional development too. If you paid the same amount of money for a graduate certificate at a accredited university for Bob's Bargain Boot Camp in the Red Barn, right? Like that to me as a hiring manager tells me that you don't make good decisions and that I don't know if I could trust you to make good decisions on my team, right? So that's where you have to be really careful about who you're networking with, who you're putting your reputation next to. It's so very important in this industry because it is small.
Yeah. I think the thing that I see a lot of is I see badges. People will post their badges, and I always want to say, like, those posts, look, I got my Beyond badge. And I'm like, that's cool. I would love to see the beyond thing that you learn to create with that badge. I want to see the work. I don't want to, I don't care. Like I can go get a badge from anywhere, or I want to see what you learn to be able to do and create, and how are you think differently now as a result of it. I think the big thing I want everyone to take away from when we talk about certificates is that, you know, it's fascinating because there are people out there who would have said 2 months ago that certificates aren't important, and it's not until they started selling a certificate that certificates become important to them. The only certificates that matter in this industry are the ones issued by the professional organization in this industry, which is ATD. They have the APTD and the CPTD, and anything else is not important. Like those are the only ones that actually carry weight, that are backed by practitioners and have competencies behind them. Everything else amounts to a completion certificate, unless it's from an accredited university issuing it. That would be my take on that. The badges, that's not going to make you stand out. It's what you learn to be able to do and how you think differently as a result of your work through doing that, right? All right, I know we're a little over time, so I want to make sure we have some time for some questions, and then we'll wrap up here in the next 5-10 minutes, if that's okay. If you have to hop off, that's totally fine. Karen, any big questions that, or things that we didn't tackle that we might want to tackle in our last few minutes here?
We do have some questions. Mary V had a question. Is there a place in L&D or e-learning for people like her that come from the technical/design side rather than the teaching side?
Go ahead, Heidi.
Me, this is my world. So I teeter between internal L&D, which is like your L&D teams under HR, or kind of like the traditional, what you just described, but also in the customer education realm. And in the customer education realm, it's very common for software as a service or SaaS companies, which Kathleen, I think you work in that space as well, don't you? No, I thought you did at one point. Sorry. But that's where like you really have to take these very technical concepts of a piece of software and turn them into layman's terms for the average not technologically advanced user to use. So I would look when you're doing your search for instructional designer, but also customer education roles, because it's a little bit different. You are serving like the customers of that particular product as your learners, not your fellow employees, right? So it's just a little bit different, but that tends to be a lot more technical in terms of like, sometimes they're called technical instructional designers or technical curriculum developers. And there's it tends to be higher paying too, because it's technical. So just added bonus.
Yeah. And customer education oftentimes falls under the marketing department, which has more money, and, then you get more pay as a result of it too. So, and those departments, customer education is great. Like they measure everything because they're from a marketing angle. Like that's where they're actually like, they're doing the L&D work that I wish we were doing in L&D. You know what I mean? What other questions, Karen?
Do you have any insight on the shift I'm seeing from instructional design to learning experience? Jennifer P.
I'll give my take on that. I think it's all semantics. There is, today it's learning experience design, and tomorrow they're going to say, "Oh, I'm a learning architect," and it's just all fancy words for instructional designer. So, there are people out there who think there are really clear distinctions between being a learning experience designer and an instructional designer, and they'll say ridiculous things. I'm quoting here that learning experience designers are different from instructional designers because they use pencils and paper, whereas instructional designers use like mouses and PowerPoint. And I'm like, I don't know, like, I don't know what you're smoking, but that's crazy.
Yeah, there's
So,
one of those. It's some Canva created thing, and it's got like a superhero and then
yes,
like a nerd, like half and half person, and it's like this is an instructional designer and this is an LXD, and like what their
good.
traits are side by side. You could find stuff like that out
Good
there. Yeah.
instructional design is learning experience design, and good learning experience design is good instructional design. So don't get wrapped up in the semantics. And what one company's going to call learning experience designer is going to be another company's e-learning developer. You know what I mean? Like there's no standards there. Go ahead, Keith. Sorry.
I definitely agree. I think, the field is really broad in terms of what you will be doing, right? And who you're going to be working with. I mean, I always, so for two teams that I was head of, I actually changed the name from instructional design to learning experience design because I think um, words, semantics, I think are pretty important too, right? And what it symbolizes is it's really about the overall experience that learners are doing. It's not about courses. It's not about e-learning modules. It's about how that learning is driving results, getting them to change their behavior or what have you. And that's not always just through like traditional learning. It could be
Sure.
hybrid learning, what have you. So, I mean, I get that I'm really tuned into those particular words, but yeah, so that's my take on it.
Yeah. But Keith, you come from a tech background, so you did a lot of work at Meta and other companies similar. And so you're going to see those types of titles more common there, whereas
Yeah.
other industries, you're going to see different titles where it might be very similar work, right? Like in the tech industry, you hear the word title like learning program manager more frequently, which is usually is related to more of the upfront parts of instructional design and much more heavy stakeholder management, and the ID
Yeah.
work is separate, right? So it
Mhm.
varies completely from company to company. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Karen, one last one.
One last question. I had so many.
That's okay. We'll do our best to answer them offline.
All right. I'm wondering if you have any insights on being authentic professional relationships via LinkedIn as opposed to traditional networking. Aaron L.
Yeah. Keith, you talked a little bit about this in this week's video.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing I talk about with my clients is really a big piece of your LinkedIn profile, and the first impression people have is charisma, right? And
Mm.
one way to really show your charismatic, if that's the word,
Yeah.
personality is through two things. It's through competence markers and through warmth markers, right? So what are people want to work with people that are approachable and people that it looks like they can get along with, right? And then also people who not just competent as in terms of years of experience, but as we were talking about earlier, have critical thinking, are curious, are growing, right? Not growing in job title necessarily, right? But have that very visible and clear on what they're doing. Now, this is not something, and a lot of stuff that we're talking about is not like add this one word or add this sentence here, right? It's a much bigger than that, and it's a bit more abstract, right? But these are the things that make you charismatic or sticky, as I like to call it too, so that hiring managers or recruiters, what have you, are swiping right, not left, on what you're doing.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think I don't know if this is a tangible way of practicing that, but I think it's a difference between being, I don't want to say assertive, being authentically risky versus deferential. You know what I mean? I think a lot of times we we approach, when you're in the outside looking in or you're the job seeker, we take this subservient role to the relationships we build, and then we kind of leave it in the hands of the other person to help foster the relationship. When it's, you can show up and be curious and ask pointed questions um, and put yourself out there. And that, it requires a vulnerability and a little bit of riskiness and getting outside your comfort zone. But I think the thing that is important to understand is that's the stuff that 99.9% of people aren't doing. And those are easy ways to stand out, from the crowd.
And I think anybody can send that blanket, like, really excited to connect with you and talk about instructional design. And then I'm always like, is there a sales pitch coming after that?
Mhm.
However, if there's no sales pitch, then I'm like, well, cool. I want to talk about instructional design too, but what? Like, have they done their research on me? Are they interested in my industry? Are they interested in something I've posted about? Like, what are more common threads other than the blanket of instructional design? Because that's going to entice me as the person they're trying to connect with and learn from to take it from there.
Yeah. Good. All right. Well, I know there was probably a ton more questions. So like I said, we'll be posting the recording to this. I'll make sure everyone has access to it. And then I will include links of how you can connect with Keith and Kathleen and Heidi. And then I'll make a space in our community where we can continue the conversation if there are any burning questions that we didn't get a chance to do or to answer. But I know, Keith and Heidi and Kathleen, if you mind me saying so myself, they're all very, very approachable people. And so if you come and show up authentically and you go, hey, that was a really great conversation, I have this follow-up question, I know there are people who would be more than happy to answer. So thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. And thank you, Heidi and Kathleen and Keith and Erin in spirit. She's at home. Thank you all.